This episode's score is fantastic and versatile. It's heart-pumping and bassy and visceral in moments of intensity and momentum, while the music in the scene in which Howard and Lalo are buried beneath the lab is beautiful and tragic. The cinematography is typically masterful. I adored the bird's eye view shot of Saul lying on the floor across from Howard. It's eerie as well as symbolic, as Saul is literally being forced to face the consequences of his actions in regards to the Howard scam. I loved the spotlight-esque shot of Gus standing over a dying Lalo. I also dug the low handheld tracking shots during those momentous sequences to which I was referring earlier, which primarily feature Mike. The payoff of Gus's planted gun was satisfying, and Lalo's final moments are phenomenally performed and directed. Gus's monologue, directed toward Eladio and Lalo and his family, is impeccably written. This is undoubtedly my favorite Gus scene in this final season. The scene between Jimmy, Kim, and Mike, in which Mike informs the pair of the plan regarding Howard's murder cover-up, is brilliant. The Mike element is interesting in that his job here and his way of handling it is reminiscent of his introductory scene in Breaking Bad. The specifics of the Howard murder cover-up story and Mike's blunt delivery of them to Jimmy and Kim is devastatingly hard-hitting. Now, I recall quite a while ago reading either a Vince Gilligan quote or a Peter Gould quote, in which one of them stated something along the lines of, "Once you complete viewing Better Call Saul, you will then view Breaking Bad through somewhat of a different lens." The meaning, or rather a meaning, of that comment became abundantly clear to me at the end of Point and Shoot. From now on, every time I watch one of the many Breaking Bad scenes that take place in the lab, I will think for at least a moment about the fact that this lab doubles as a cemetery for two principal Better Call Saul characters. I love the opening and the Perfect Day track that plays throughout. The song, especially in the context of the show, is this interesting combination of eerie and beautiful, and of course ironic. The editing is also a highlight of the intro. It's fluid and excellent. Anytime Don Eladio graces my television, it is a complete and utter treat, and his return in Fun and Games is no exception. Stephen Bauer is such a captivating and charismatic presence. The entirety of the scene is very tense, though the greatest moment comes at its end. Don Eladio telling Gus that he saw hate in his eyes, and a little bit is okay as long as he remembers who's boss, gave me chills, truly. And this dynamite scene is capped with a pitch-perfect image. We get a POV shot from the bottom of the Don's pool as Gus glares down at the water. So much has happened here, and unbeknownst to Eladio, so much is about to. The exchange between Mike and Manuel Varga is quite emotional. It's really well written and excellently shot, as each individual stands on opposite sides of the screen, a large fence separating these two men with vastly different moral compasses. Jimmy and Kim's breakup was exceedingly sad, in large part, of course, due to Seahorn and Odenkirk's exceptionally committed performances, and the abrupt time jump at scene's end was quite jarring in a completely effective and artistic way. I loved the alteration of the opening theme and how it lets the viewer know to expect something unique from the norm. It very interestingly catches you off guard. Now, before I go any further, I first want to address the elephant in the room, Jeff the cab driver. It was about 2 weeks prior to Jeff's return to the show that I learned of Don Harvey's recasting. It was really a producerial necessity that couldn't be avoided, so going into my first viewing of the episode, I simply tried to put the behind-the-scenes business out of my mind. Honestly, Pat Healy's Jeff was initially jarring. Don Harvey has such a specific aura about him, and the last time we saw his Jeff in the season 5 premiere, he was slightly intimidating as well as in control, while the meek Gene is kind of at his mercy. The idea here in 610 is that Gene has completely turned the tables on Jeff. So as much as it makes complete sense story-wise, which is most important, that it's now Jeff's turn to be meek, as Gene has made himself at home in his house with his mother. Given that this is the first time we're seeing the recasted Jeff, it initially does feel like a different character from the cab driver we've seen in the past 2 seasons. But I kept watching, and and unexpectedly became engrossed in the story of this great episode. And every time a new episode is released, I typically view it 3 times prior to the release of the subsequent one, and I'm extremely glad to say that upon each viewing of Nippy, I enjoyed the episode more and more, which is the usual for Better Call Saul, and really grew to accept and enjoy Pat Healy as Jeff the cab driver. In fact, it's gotten to the point where I can't picture Jeff not being played by Healy. I absolutely dug the lead-up/build-up to the great mall heist. It's so clever and detailed, and the execution of the heist itself is just fantastic. The plethora of surveillance cameras add such a great dimension here. I mean, they're also integral to Gene's elaborate scheme. Slippin' Jeffy forcing Gene to stall and keep Frank's eyes focused on him to give Jeff enough time to regain consciousness was a major highlight of the scam. I adored the nods to all the past season's black and white introductions. Of course, Jeff returns, so we see the continuation of the storyline set up in the Season 4 and Season 5 openings. In the Season 3 opening, Gene advises a shoplifter to get a lawyer, much to the security guard's dismay. One of those security guards ultimately calls the EMTs when Gene collapses at Cinnabon, and this is the same security guard who spends much of his time in Frank's surveillance room in Nippy. Then, back in the Season 2 opener, Gene gets locked in the employees-only hallway. He's trapped for quite some time, as exiting the emergency door would signal the police. So to kill time, Gene writes, "SG was here," on the wall, and in a montage in 610, we get a split-second glimpse at this same wall. I dug the simple A story, B story structure of the episode. One plotline set in the Gene timeline, the other of course set in the Breaking Bad timeline. I thoroughly enjoyed the implementation of Walt and Jesse. It was great how we're immediately inside the crystal ship right at the commencement of the cold open. It was cool getting an alternate look at the classic scene from Breaking Bad episode 208, in which Saul name drops Lalo and Ignacio. It was a blast to see the return of this legendary dynamic. It was interesting hearing Jesse ask about Lalo, a small, kind of eye-wideningly cool moment in which the worlds of these two shows merge. And the final shot of the scene of the dug grave once the crystal ship has departed, as a black and white Gene appears within it as we transition into the Gene timeline. It is potentially the show's greatest and most creative and ominous transition. Gene, Jeff, and Buddy's identity scheme is so elaborate and clever. It also leads to great guest appearances from Buzz himself, Devin Rattray, as well as Kevin Sussman. And the fact that Sussman's character has cancer is an intriguing creative decision, considering this is the sole episode of this show at the time of 611's airing in which Walter White, Cancer Man himself, is featured. The final scene of this episode is incredibly interesting and extraordinarily edited. The smooth cuts back and forth between Saul approaching Walt's school and Gene approaching his scam victim Mr. Link's home. And we know that Saul's path into JP Wynn and ultimately into Walt's classroom is one from which he cannot turn back, and eventually leads to his downfall. And given that the slick editing kind of melds these two scenes into one, the moment the screen cuts to black whilst Gene is breaking into this poor guy's house, I became instantaneously convinced that this particular path would surely lead to Gene's downfall as well. Waterworks is not only a showcase of Ray Seahorn's immense talent, it is also the perfect penultimate episode of this series. Kim's exceedingly mundane life is so effectively displayed and edited, as we see here that her major external conflict is deciding between Miracle Whip and Duke's style of mayonnaise, slightly less adrenaline pumping than her former life of crime with Jimmy and her former life of being a successful, reputable attorney. The phone call between Jimmy and Kim is tragic, though expertly shot, as we get this brilliant, extensive one-shot focused on Kim nearing the call's end. It was also a great, though kind of harrowing touch that after Kim slams the phone down, she's trembling and twitching as though that phone call forced her apparent PTSD to surface. Seahorn is also wonderful in the scene featuring Kim's bus breakdown via another one of Gilligan's much appreciated lengthy one-shots. She's also extremely impressive in the scene in which she and Jimmy's divorce papers are signed. Kim says so much here tear without barely saying a word. You just see the pain and confusion in her eyes at the sight of her former husband, who is now completely unrecognizable. The scene in which Kim provides Cheryl with her confession is phenomenal and surprising. The direction and editing here is top tier, and the silence, apart from the sounds of nature, enhances the very tense tone of the scene. The continuation of the break-in is layered and intense and somewhat comedic. Gene is ready to leave, Jeff waiting out front for him, and as we've seen so many times before, he can't help himself. He turns away from the exit and heads up the stairs, at which point we, the viewer, catch a glimpse of Gene's cancer-ridden scam victim coming too. Meanwhile, Jeff notices a vehicle slow down and come to a halt directly behind him. As Gene strolls through Mr. Link's room with a drink, checking out his collection of watches and hats like a madman, we learn that it is the cops camping out behind Jeff. Simultaneously, Gene looks down to see that Mr. Link is no longer unconscious on the floor, but before he can race down the stairs and out of the front door, Mr. Link emerges from the bathroom and plops himself down at the bottom of the staircase, blocking Gene's path to freedom. It is then comedically revealed that the cops who had been camping out behind Jeff's taxi are paying his paranoid ass zero attention, as they're busy discussing the ins and outs of one of the officer's sandwiches. This is of course when an unfathomably nervous Jeff accidentally swerves into a parked vehicle, while Gene, who thankfully didn't have to smash a dog's urn over Mr. Link's head due to the fact that he conked out at the bottom of the stairs, flees the scene of the crime. This amazing, masterfully paced sequence causes a vast array of different emotions throughout its pretty compact duration, and it's certainly one of my favorites of this final season. This brilliant episode is capped with an excellent scene that brings the show full circle in multiple ways. Firstly, when Gene is faced with an old Better Call Saul commercial, the reflection in his glasses is colorized in an otherwise black and white frame, practically identical to the first ever scene in this show, and the majority of the scene between Gene and Marion really takes me back to the show's first half, particularly season 3, which heavily features the horrible concept of elderly abuse. And Marion's method of discovering Gene Takovic's true identity is a prime example of poetic justice, as she makes said discovery on her new computer, which was purchased for her by Jeff with the money he made from the mall heist, which was all orchestrated by Gene. After 3 viewings of this episode, I can confidently say that Saul Gone is a wonderful finale featuring what I believe to be the best performance of Bob Odenkirk's career, clear and profound themes that tie together multiple of Jimmy's interactions in multiple time periods, creating a cohesive and meaningful narrative. It also features an ending that is anecdotally very thought-provoking and, again, anecdotally quite unexpected, but I'll get back to that a bit later. The implementation of characters from the past, namely Marie, Walt, and Chuck, was absolutely perfect. The performances given here by Betsy Brandt, Bryan Cranston, and Michael McKean respectively are so brilliant and instantaneously gripping and impactful. These amazing characters' involvement felt so right and tremendously organic to the story of this episode. I really loved the through line of regret and Saul's refusal to genuinely acknowledge this concept, up until the big court climax, of course. Now let's momentarily put the spotlight on a man who has proven himself to be a really impeccable and special actor, Mr. Bob Odenkirk. He really gets a chance in Saul Gone to showcase his range as he portrays each of the 3 incarnations of his character in this 70-minute story. We get Gene Takovic for the first act or so, then for much of the episode's duration, we're treated to the great Saul Goodman, until the final act or so, when Saul reclaims the name Jimmy McGill. In fact, let's discuss the rebirth, if you will, of James Morgan McGill, which is unquestionably the aspect of this series finale that has taken up the most space in and power of my brain. It initially felt ever so slightly jarring, if that's even the correct word, for a couple of reasons. Odenkirk's monologue certainly felt authentic and heartfelt, but I instinctively had my guard up due to the number of tricks that Saul Goodman has pulled on myself as a viewer, as well as many others in the past. Also, once Gene was prepared to smash an urn, filled to the brim with a dog's ashes over the head of an innocent cancer victim in episode 12, I was in utter acceptance mode in regards to Gene simply being too far gone for redemption. and being completely soulless and sociopathic. But given that Jimmy's emergence and honesty is resulting in decades more prison time, you know he's being sincere. So, following my first viewing of the series finale, I felt that I needed to take a breath and process this character's end over the course of a few days. So prior to my second viewing, I prepared myself to zero in on a potential forthcoming mental break, which would suddenly drastically alter Saul's course of action. This mental break didn't occur in the excellently acted moment in which Gene experiences a crawl space-esque laughing fit after seeing the "my lawyer will ream your ass" engraving within his cell, due to the fact that he remains Saul Goodman-esque for much of the episode following said fit. It is evidently Saul's discovery of the info that Kim confessed to the authorities in regard to the pair's involvement in Howard Hamlin's death that truly internally strikes a chord with Jimmy McGill. It is in this moment of Saul discovering that Kim has shed her mask and decided to face the consequences of her painful past choices that his desired end goal alters. Suddenly, his sneaky method of having his prison sentence diminished and his scarily desperate need to be on top no longer matters. Kim's atonement inspired Jimmy McGill to do the same, and in Kim's company, to prove to her, practically the only human being that believed in him and loved him unconditionally, that Jimmy McGill still exists. Not Saul Goodman, not Gene Takovic, not Victor Sinclair, the OG JMM. I stated in my review of part 1 of this final season that the Hamlin scam was Saul Goodman's greatest trick, but I'd like to retract that. Saul Goodman's greatest trick was being honest and sincere in a courtroom for the first time. He has spent so much of his life running from his past, refusing to believe that his actions have often dire consequences. But in Odenkirk's magnificently delivered monologue, McGill truly bears his soul, and he references such specific anecdotes from his relatively distant past, which tells me that Jimmy McGill has always been there, buried beneath the showy personas. And at this show's end, Jimmy decides to finally drop the act and live the remainder of his days as the guy he should have always been. As Mr. Link said in episode 611, you only go around once. You can't escape who you are, not even by creating a colorful character like Saul. And it was even shown to us in the season 6 premiere that Jimmy was still there behind his Goodman mask. If you recall, throughout the introductory scene of Wine and Roses, we're given a tour of Saul Goodman's comedically extravagant palace, featuring what feels like 1,000,000 rooms, including a bathroom complete with a golden toilet. But at scene's end, we focus in on one of the show's most symbolic objects, the top of the Zafir bottle, which represents Jimmy and Kim's former life of illegality and fun. And he kept this item through all of the Saul Goodman years. I can now say that our main character's end was satisfying. It feels right, as does the shot, reminiscent of the one from the pilot, in which Jimmy and Kim lean against a concrete wall next to one another, sharing a cigarette. I'm sad that this nearly perfect in every conceivable way show is over, but I'm also a firm believer in the idea that every good story has an end. And this final season has consistently been at a caliber higher than I ever thought possible, and I had exceedingly high expectations coming into the show's final chapter. I am in love with this beautifully made television show, and this undoubtedly won't be the last time that I discuss it.